Dr. Carter Hayes's boots crunched softly against the rocky terrain of Arkania Prime, the towering obsidian cliffs looming above him. He adjusted the strap of his medkit, his other hand gripping a scanning device. The planet's wilderness had a way of making him feel small, insignificant, yet entirely aware of his own fragility. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and damp vegetation, a strange mixture that kept his senses sharp. He had been sent here to document life forms, but nothing could have prepared him for the creature he was about to encounter. The sound came first, a deep, resonating growl that seemed to vibrate through his chest. Carter froze mid-step, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Slowly he turned toward the noise, his eyes scanning the dense foliage ahead. Then he saw her. She was massive, a creature straight out of a nightmare. Scales the color of molten iron glinted faintly under the hazy sunlight, and her enormous frame heaved with labored breaths. Her wings, once majestic and powerful, were now a tattered mess. One hung at an unnatural angle, the torn membrane dripping blood onto the scorched earth. Her sharp, golden eyes flicked toward him, narrowing with a mixture of pain and wariness. Carter's instinct screamed at him to leave. Every survival training module he'd ever completed echoed the same advice: retreat when faced with a Drakorran. They were apex predators, known for their aggression and intelligence, capable of dismantling anything foolish enough to challenge them. But this one wasn't attacking. She was struggling, wounded, and vulnerable in a way he hadn't thought possible. His mind raced through the possibilities. Leave her to die and continue his mission? It was the logical choice. But as he stood there, watching her ragged breaths and the way her claws dug into the earth in a futile attempt to rise, another thought took root. Could he live with himself if he did nothing? Slowly, cautiously, Carter unlatched his medkit. The sound of the clasps made the Drakorran's ears twitch and her growl deepened. "Easy," he murmured, his voice soft and steady. He held his hands out, showing he wasn't a threat. "I'm just going to help. If you'll let me." Her eyes fixed on him, unblinking and intense. He could feel her gaze like a physical weight. Every step closer felt like a gamble, but she didn't move to attack. Her growl softened, though her claws remained buried in the dirt. Carter knelt beside her massive wing, his hands trembling as he assessed the damage. The tear was deep, the bone likely fractured. Blood seeped steadily from the wound, and the edges of the membrane looked inflamed. He worked quickly, using sterilizing agents and a portable biosealant to clean and close the worst of the tear. The Drakorran flinched and let out a sharp hiss as the sealant began to set. Carter paused, his breath catching. "I know it hurts," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this will help." He fashioned a splint for the fractured bone, using lightweight alloys from his pack. His movements were careful, methodical, and unhurried, each action a silent reassurance that he meant no harm. The creature's breathing slowed slightly as the splint stabilized her wing. She watched him the entire time, her golden eyes filled with something that Carter couldn't quite name, curiosity maybe, or something deeper. When he was done, Carter stepped back slowly, leaving a few food rations at her feet. The Drakorran didn't move to eat them, but neither did she strike. Instead, she let out a low, rumbling sound, almost like a sigh. Carter turned and walked away, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he glanced back over his shoulder, he saw her still watching him, her gaze unwavering. In that moment he realized he hadn't just saved a creature's life. He had taken the first step toward something much greater, though he couldn't yet fathom what it might be. Back at the outpost, Carter stared at his terminal, the faint glow of the screen casting shadows on his face. His logs were meticulous, every detail of Arkania Prime's flora and fauna documented with care. Yet his mind wasn't on the vibrant mosses or the skittering insect-like creatures he had catalogued earlier. It was on her, the Drakorran with the wounded wing. He had expected her to lash out, to see him as nothing more than prey or a nuisance, but she hadn't. Instead, she had let him help, a silent acceptance that haunted him now. Days passed, and Carter continued his research, moving deeper into the forest. He couldn't stop himself from looking over his shoulder, scanning the horizon for any sign of her. At night, in the relative safety of his shelter, he replayed the encounter in his mind. Was she still alive? Had the injury healed, or had he only prolonged her suffering? He told himself it didn't matter. He was here to study, to observe, not to interfere. But the weight of that logic felt hollow. Humanity had ventured far into the stars, driven by curiosity and the need to understand, but in doing so they carried their humanity with them. Carter wasn't a soldier or a survivalist. He was a scientist. And yet, the act of helping her felt like the most human thing he had ever done. Strange things began to happen around the camp. At first it was subtle, broken branches near the perimeter, faint claw marks on nearby trees. Then it became more obvious. Once he found a freshly killed animal, a large, six-legged creature he hadn't yet identified, placed just beyond his camp's boundary. The kill was clean, precise, and far too large for him to consume alone. Carter couldn't deny it any longer. She was watching him. The realization was both unsettling and fascinating. He set up motion detectors around the camp, hoping to catch a glimpse of her without risking confrontation. The devices picked up faint movements at the edges of their range, large, deliberate steps, as if she was circling the area. Yet, she never came closer, maintaining a distance that seemed almost respectful. One night, Carter stepped outside, the faint light of Arkania's twin moons casting long shadows across the landscape. He held a ration pack in his hands, walking cautiously to the edge of the camp. Placing it on the ground, he retreated, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Then he waited. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, he saw her. Emerging from the shadows, the Drakorran moved with a grace that belied her size. Her wing, though still bound by the makeshift splint, looked steadier. She paused a few feet from the ration pack, her golden eyes flicking toward Carter. He didn't move. She lowered her head, sniffed the offering, and then, with an almost delicate motion, took it. For a moment, their eyes met again, and Carter felt a strange sense of connection, as if she was acknowledging him not as a threat, but as something else entirely. She turned and disappeared into the forest, her movements silent and swift. Carter remained there, the cool night air biting at his skin. Whatever had passed between them was fragile, unspoken, but undeniably real. He didn't know what it meant or what would come next, but for the first time since arriving on Arkania Prime, he didn't feel alone. Weeks had passed, and Carter had all but resigned himself to the idea that the Drakorran might never return. The signs of her presence near his camp had stopped, and the forest seemed quieter, more distant somehow. He tried to focus on his research, documenting the planet's delicate ecosystems and unusual predators, but there was a hollow quality to his days now. The bond, if it could even be called that, had left an impression on him, one that lingered in her absence. He was on a routine field survey, mapping a region of volcanic outcroppings that bordered one of the planet's vast jungles. The scanner in his hand beeped steadily, marking mineral deposits and plant clusters, but his attention wavered. The terrain was unforgiving, sharp rocks and unstable ground forcing him to tread carefully. The attack came without warning. The first creature leapt from the shadows, its leathery hide gleaming as it landed mere feet from him. Its 6 legs, ending in razor-sharp claws, tore at the earth as it crouched low, preparing to spring. Carter barely had time to draw his stun weapon before another appeared, then another. A pack. Their glowing red eyes locked onto him and a deep, guttural snarl filled the air. He fired the weapon, the crackling discharge striking the lead predator. It howled in pain but didn't retreat. Instead the others surged forward, teeth bared. Carter backed away, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew he couldn't outrun them, his only chance was to fight. The predators lunged. A deafening roar shattered the air, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the ground beneath him. The predators froze mid-attack, their heads snapping toward the source of the sound. Carter turned as well, his eyes widening in disbelief. She was back. The Drakorran descended from above, her massive form casting a shadow over the clearing. Her wings, now fully healed, spread wide as she landed with a thundering crash. The predators hesitated, snarling but unsure. Then she roared again, her golden eyes blazing with fury. The lead predator lunged at her, its claws aiming for her throat. With a speed that defied her size, she struck, her jaws snapping shut around its neck. A sickening crunch echoed through the clearing as she flung its lifeless body aside. The other predators scrambled, their courage evaporating as they turned and fled into the forest. Carter stood frozen, his weapon still clutched in his hand. The Drakorran turned to him, her breathing heavy but controlled. For a moment he thought she might attack him, but instead she stepped aside, revealing what she had brought with her. 3 smaller Drakorrans emerged from the shadows, their movements tentative but curious. Hatchlings. They were miniature versions of her, their scales a brighter, almost iridescent hue. They chirped softly, their heads tilting as they observed him. Carter's breath caught. She hadn't just come back, she had brought her young. The mother Drakorran nudged one of the hatchlings forward, her gaze shifting between Carter and her offspring. He knelt slowly, unsure of what to do but unwilling to show fear. The smallest of the hatchlings approached him, its golden eyes mirroring its mother's. It sniffed at him cautiously before letting out a soft trill, a sound almost like a purr. The mother stepped closer and lowered her head, nudging something toward him with her snout. It was a single scale larger than his hand and shimmering with a metallic sheen. Carter picked it up carefully, the weight of the gesture sinking in. This wasn't just a token, it was a gift, a sign of trust. For the first time, Carter allowed himself to smile. Whatever he had done months ago by helping her, it had mattered. It had changed something. As the hatchlings chirped and the mother watched him with those knowing eyes, he realized he wasn't just a visitor on this planet anymore. He was part of something larger, something profoundly alien and yet deeply familiar. Carter stood at the edge of a massive clearing, staring at the alien landscape that had become his second home. The jungle hummed with life, a symphony of calls, clicks, and rustling leaves. Yet his focus was entirely on the Drakorran mother and her 3 hatchlings, who were circling a carcass she had brought to them. He observed their interaction carefully, feeling both like a witness to something ancient and a participant in something entirely new. The hatchlings were growing fast, their once small frames now more defined, their movements more confident. Their scales, once bright and delicate, had darkened to hues closer to their mothers, though they retained a youthful iridescence. They were still learning how to hunt, how to navigate their world, and their mother was a patient teacher. But her gaze often wandered back to Carter. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a connection that defied the limitations of language or species. He had saved her life once, and now she allowed him to stay to witness her family, to be part of their world. As the hatchlings devoured their meal, she approached him slowly, her massive frame towering over him but her movements calm. Carter had stopped feeling fear around her long ago. Instead he felt a quiet awe. She lowered her head to his level, her golden eyes locking with his. Without thinking, Carter raised his hand and placed it gently against her scaled snout. The texture was rough but warm, a reminder that she was a living, breathing being with thoughts and emotions he could only guess at. She let out a low rumble, almost like a purr, and for a moment, Carter felt the barriers between them dissolve. He withdrew his hand and reached into his pack, pulling out his datapad. Over the months, he had compiled an extensive record of her species' behaviors, movements, and even social interactions. The footage was stunning. Moments of tenderness between her and her young, displays of dominance during territorial disputes, and even her silent but watchful protection of him when other predators ventured too close. He scrolled through the recordings, showing her brief clips. Her head tilted slightly as if she understood that the images on the screen were of her and her family. She let out a soft, questioning growl, nudging the datapad with her snout. Carter chuckled softly. "That's you," he said, though the words were more for himself than for her. The hatchlings approached, their curiosity drawing them to him. One of them chirped and pawed at the datapad, its claws tapping against the screen. Carter laughed again, the sound echoing through the clearing. It felt good and natural. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the forest, the Drakorran mother returned to her hatchlings. She nudged them toward a cluster of large rocks where they often rested, her protective instincts always on high alert. Carter watched as they settled in, their small bodies curling against hers for warmth. He sat on a nearby rock, his gaze drifting to the horizon. His mission to Arkania Prime was nearing its end. Soon a retrieval ship would arrive to take him back to Earth. The thought filled him with a strange heaviness. He had come here as an outsider, expecting to study the planet and leave without leaving a mark. Instead, he had become part of something far greater. The Drakorran mother lifted her head, her eyes meeting his once more. There was no fear, no hostility, only understanding. Carter nodded as if to say, "I won't forget." In that moment he knew that when he left, a part of him would stay behind, etched into the memory of this alien family. And perhaps, somewhere deep in her heart, the Drakorran would remember him too, not as a threat or an intruder, but as the human who had chosen to save her.